Hey guys, it's Nick. Welcome to another episode of T-365. Today's episode, we're going to take a look at cybersecurity insurance requirements as it relates to MFA and MFA reporting, as I believe that self-attestation, as we're already seeing, is going to go away. And we're going to have some really strict requirements for MFA reporting and proof of evidence of MFA within our environments in order to achieve those types of policies. So stay tuned, because we're going to go through 5 of the top considerations I have for MFA reporting and MFA enforcement in Microsoft. And I'm also going to be showing you a third-party tool that I built to help you with this reporting and automation around detecting drift or exclusions in your MFA policies that you should be aware of. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Nick, Microsoft MVP. I've been creating content here on the channel for MSPs around Microsoft for the better half of a decade. If you haven't already, definitely subscribe to the channel to see more content around the MSP space in Microsoft. Otherwise, let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, so if we get into the 5 considerations here that I wanted to cover, the first consideration that we just have to keep in mind is recognizing the evolution of MFA enforcement within Microsoft over time. So technically today, there's still 3 methods that you could leverage to enforce MFA on users. The first that's been around the longest here for us, that most of us have been familiar with, is per user MFA. And so per user MFA is also known now as the legacy method of MFA enforcement, and there will be an end of life date that I'll get into here that Microsoft's announced, where they're just going to deprecate this form of enforcement. But you really had 3 options here that you could use to apply MFA to users, one of which was enabled, the other setting was enforced, and the last was just disabled. So disabled, of course, just means that MFA is turned off for the user. Enforced means that they immediately had to register an MFA method the next time that they signed in. And enabled means that they were prompted to set up MFA, but they had an initial 14-day grace period where they could just say skip for now and move into whatever application they were looking at signing into. So all these methods here, the nice part about them in the past here was that from a reporting layer, we kind of just in this portal had a list of our users, and we could see what methods we had applied to these users as well. So it was really easy to kind of run a report and just say, well, MFA is not enforced for John, it's disabled. So it's kind of more binary in that regard. Then what Microsoft came out with, because of just all the attacks going on, some of the most common, obviously, just being phishing attacks, where 2FA would prevent 99% of those attacks, where somebody's password was stolen, either maybe through phishing or through a brute force attack, password spray attack, things like that. We came out with security defaults, which basically kind of captured this enabled type of setting where you had a 14-day period in order to register for MFA. So the users would be prompted, they'd be enforced to skip. But the basic thing here is that this is binary setting in the tenant. And so instead of a user policy that we have over here, this was more of a tenant-wide policy that you would be applying, and it was binary. So either MFA was turned on for every user in the account, or it was off for every user in the account. And you could still turn this off and use the per user settings, which is what a lot of people did, because you have these granular types of exclusions that you need to provide either through break glass accounts or service accounts, or some type of, again, service account that's used for a third-party application, or maybe SMTP relay for printers or scanners, things like that. So people ended up turning this off in a lot of cases, just because it wasn't a lot of granularity that you can get. And now if you don't have your licensing set up, we'll get into this here in a minute, but all net new tenants have security defaults on by default, which does things like enforce MFA, blocks legacy authentication protocols, things like that within the tenant. But that was just another consideration that we had there. The third type of MFA enforcement is definitely the most secure, the most flexible, and the most modern, which is conditional access. And so conditional access is what follows the zero trust architecture here. And fundamentally, if you don't know what it is, it basically follows if-then statements to apply certain controls. So if certain conditions are met, certain controls are applied, like MFA is the most common one that you would set up with conditional access policies. Now, the difference here as far as the gating goes was that this was gated by a license requirement of Entra ID P1, which is only available in certain base level plans that are more premium, like Business Premium in the SMB space. You can also purchase this standalone and bolt it on into some existing offer that you had, like Business Standard, but in a lot of those cases it would make more sense just to upgrade fully into Business Premium. So the other consideration that you have here is that when we talk about security defaults and conditional access, you can't have both on or both checked at the same time. Either one or the other has to be on. So if you have security defaults on, you have to turn that off in order to create conditional access policies. But the other thing that we have to consider here is we think about per user MFA, conditional access policies, and security defaults working in unison. Again, I already talked about how you can't have security defaults and conditional access policies turned on at the same time. But from a reporting layer, these things don't exactly flow through either as far as the per user settings, meaning that if you see user 3 in here with a disabled status, they may still have security defaults being applied, or they may have a conditional access policy that's being applied and the reporting does not sync with each other. So it confuses a lot of users because they'll go into this legacy portal for per user MFA, they'll see that the user's disabled, but really they're being enforced through one of these policies. So your reporting kind of got really mucky in the sense of kind of what's the North Star, what's the sense of truth here, source of truth when we talk about how MFA is being applied to the user as well. So now if we focus in and drill in on conditional access, which again I think is the best form of enablement that you can conduct because it does give you the granularity you need to create necessary exclusions where you need to, also kind of accommodating for different user flows or different sign-in locations, things like that, devices and all of that as well too. You also have some unique considerations here, which brings me to my second consideration that I always look at here, is that when we take a look at conditional access policies, they can quickly become Swiss cheese in this sense of your exclusions. And what I mean by that is that effectively over time, many of us have created many different conditional access policies to accommodate for workflows for a particular customer or for particular sign-ins like I just alluded to there. And you may have one to many policies here that enforce MFA. But within these policies here, you can also have your exclusions. And exclusions is basically just saying that we could have users that are excluded directly, groups that are excluded that have many different users within them that could be excluded. We could also be whitelisting or excluding certain locations like trusted IPs, trusted countries, things like that as well too. And so what naturally is happening over time here is that we have a few different considerations here where, again, we may be applying a conditional access policy with MFA enforcement, but if we're excluding users from it, they're actually going to not be prompted for MFA, and it defeats the purpose of those protections that we're trying to put into place as well too. So with this, when we talk about exclusions and we talk about some of the recommendations there, we also have, again, this consideration of drift. And drift is really just over the course of time through business processes, you may have different exclusions that pop up and they create holes within your policies where there's actually an attack vector that could be exposed there. And so some of the exclusions here that you would commonly see is temporary exclusions to bypass MFA for a particular reason. And there might be different use cases for that. Maybe you had to temporarily whitelist the account because you needed modern or legacy authentication for a second. The other of which we commonly see here is you have certain things like travel requests where users say, hey, I'm going to be in Italy, I need to be able to sign in, and you create an exclusion for them to be able to sign into that country where normally you're only allowing sign-ins from the US as an example, that naturally occur. And what I put in parentheses here is temporary, because often cases we put these exclusions into place, but then we forget about them, and then they just leave holes within our environment. Same thing with travel request. And one of the more common ones you also see too is group membership. So if you exclude a group and then you end up adding members in there, there's not really great reporting within the platform today to show who's within that group. And it could be users that you don't want necessarily being excluded from that policy. So this may be something that's not necessarily malicious, but it just happens naturally over time, which again can create holes. And then we do have the consideration for malicious drift, or malicious tampering, I really should say, in this particular case. And this is where a bad actor has gotten initial access and they have certain administrative privileges, not necessarily needing a global admin role. They could be a conditional access administrator, but they're either updating the conditional access policy or they're deleting it. And this is happening so much so that MITRE has actually even come out with their latest report with a technique specifically for conditional access modifications. And so normally when you see an update record here, you're going to be doing things, or the bad actor is going to be doing things like adding a trusted location, or they're going to, exclude a user or create some type of exclusions. And this is all really so that they can maintain persistence in the account. So they got an initial access, they want to say, I don't want to be prompted for MFA. I want to maintain my access. I've got the user's password. I just want to bypass MFA. So they may add a trusted location that says you don't need MFA if you're signing in from Russia, as an example. Or they may say, I'm just going to exclude the user that I breached, and they're not going to be enforced this conditional access policy. So that's a common way that we see also these exclusions as well too. So there's a couple of recommendations that I have as it relates to kind of the conditional access policy as a whole. The first and foremost comment that I'll make here is that you always want to create a blanket conditional access policy for all users that enforces MFA. And when I say this, you really have some unique considerations here, which is to say, again, this is all users that are scoped. This is all applications. You're not specifically calling out a few applications. You're not whitelisting any locations, meaning you're not saying, oh, if you're on the corporate network, then you don't have to use MFA. You used to do that. I don't think that's very much secure anymore. It's not a best practice when it comes to MFA. You're not filtering anything else out, like certain client types, like the client applications versus browser sign-ins, certain device types. You're not filtering out anything there, and then you're requiring MFA. So with this in mind, all you're really doing from a sense of exclusion here, as far as best practice goes, is break glass accounts. In your exclusions, because this is best practice to not lock yourself out of the account, but you try to stick to that as much as you can, where you're not excluding other groups or other users as part of that policy. And if you are, you should be documenting them and have a formal change control process around how this policy gets modified, because it's very important that users don't have holes in the sense of not being enforced MFA across all the sign-ins that they have within the Microsoft ecosystem, but also maybe any SSO applications that you've set up as well too. The other recommendation that I have here is just simply to review your conditional access policies periodically to try to detect for this drift. So I'll be getting into, again, the third-party tool that can help you with this and monitor for this. but you also can leverage and review a tool directly within the sign-in logs, which I'll show you a little bit later, which can show you sign-ins where conditional access actually isn't being applied to a user, which has some caveats that I'll get into here as well. The next consideration that I want to talk about here is number 3, and that is going to be that our MFA types have also evolved as well too. So when I say MFA types, I've written a whole blog post on this. I did a separate video which you can check out here. But when we think about more of the legacy methods of MFA and just getting prompted here, you have things like SMS text, you have a phone call that you could get, you have an email OTP token that's sent to you, and that's just a one-time code that you enter in to fulfill your MFA request. And with these are considered weaker forms of MFA now, just due to the attack surface shifting, new attack methods coming out. And to highlight some of those, they're prone to things like phishing, they're prone to things like SIM swapping, they're prone to things like social engineering. And then we have considerations for, kind of the next layer that got introduced, which was Microsoft Authenticator. And with Microsoft Authenticator, you have various forms here that have evolved again over time too, that came out where you have an OTP code that can be sent, one-time password. You have a push where a user could approve an MFA request that comes through. And then you now have something known as number matching to combat against a common attack known as MFA fatigue. So when we talk about MFA types that you should have enrolled as well too, you really want to start moving into stronger forms that you would like to get into. The third, most strongest form would be something, where we consider phishing resistant MFA. And with this form, we get into some considerations here too, that you would have like a FIDO2 key, like a YubiKey. You have pass keys that you could leverage. And you have things like Windows Hello. And these are considered, some of the strongest forms of MFA because they're more phishing resistant. But when we think about some of the types that we would want to start eliminating from our environment, we really want to get out of the motion of these really legacy forms that can be subject to many different types of attacks. Even just the transmission of those could be intercepted. So we want to have maybe stronger forms. And even things like OTP is something that commonly attackers set up as another method after they've enabled MFA, after they've initially compromised an account, just due to the nature of the logging that goes on with Microsoft. This one, from a push notification standpoint, is prone to MFA fatigue, where an attacker will send a user hundreds, maybe many different requests to say approve, 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 and the user just ends up blanketly accepting that to get through. So number matching came out, so they have to put in a specific number into their application in order to approve the request, which kind of blocks or prevents some of the MFA fatigue requests. But this is still not phishing resistant because it's still subject to social engineering techniques as well too. And then you get into the phishing resistant concepts here as well. So within the Entra portal, you can actually modify your authentication methods policy to prevent the use of some of these legacy forms. And I do recommend at least blocking SMS, phone, and email OTP. So you have more of the stronger methods here that are less prone to attacks that we've seen in the past as well. So the fourth consideration I want to cover here is just kind of the lack of central reporting. We talked about, the 3 various MFA enforcement types that we could have within the account that aren't necessarily translating across the reporting aspects that we get. And so reporting has become very cumbersome for us within the account. But I would also say it's just a lot of noise in the reports. If we think about MFA adoption and MFA reporting here for a particular user, if I'm an MSP, to avoid the noise, I really want to be taking a look at things like, is the user licensed? Do they have a mailbox? Are they a shared mailbox? Because we shouldn't be looking for shared mailboxes in our reports. Are they a service account? Are they a guest user? Is their account even enabled? Is their sign-in enabled? And then when we get into the other considerations here for what we would consider to kind of have the essential reporting, it's really answering the questions of, are they covered by conditional access? Are they covered by security defaults? Or are they covered by per user MFA? And then if you get into conditional access even further, you ask the question of, are there exclusions that we should be keeping into mind where this user is actually not prompted for MFA when they're signing in? So as you can imagine, this gets really complex as far as being able to quickly identify the reporting goes. And my third-party tool I'm going to show you again helps with that. We'll walk through that to identify and answer all these questions for you really quickly. But I think the best report that you can get is within the Ontra portal. So let's pop in there now and see what that looks like. Okay, so in order to access this report, you do need an Ontra ID P1 license. You'll find this under the authentication method section. You can either go to activity or user registration details to see some reporting around this here. You'll see here in this case, I have a test tenant here that has 59% of your organization isn't capable. And it'll actually take you into a pre-filtered view of that report. You can actually see here multi-factor authentication capable, and it says not capable. Now the parameters that make that up is a combination of, is this user ever signed in? Plus, do they have any type of MFA enforcement that's going on with them, like a conditional access policy or the per user MFA, things like that as well too. But I think my problem with this report is really hard to discern why this person's not capable and being able to quickly drill into that depending on what type of MFA enforcement you're using. I'm going to pick on Oliver Queen here throughout these examples because it's a user that I've excluded from a conditional access policy that's enforcing MFA, and he's showing here as not capable because he's already signed in, but that conditional access policy is not being applied to him, so he's not actually being prompted in any way for multi-factor authentication. In the user registration details though, you can see the default MFA factor being used here, and you can see that this person's actually registered. Now the thing that's the gap here again also is that if you're applying conditional access, some of these users may have conditional access being enforced, but effectively they may have exclusions. They might not be using certain locations. There could be a lot of holes even though they've actually registered for multi-factor. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's being applied across the board for all the sign-in locations or devices or apps that they'd be signing into. So there's a lot of caveats with this, which is why I'd like to dial up that reporting a little bit further. Okay, so the last consideration here that I want to cover is just going over the sign-in logs. And I would say these sign-in logs are very helpful, and actually Microsoft points you to looking at these to try to identify MFA gaps or MFA enforcement. But the contrary aspect of this is that they are overwhelming. So there's a lot of factors that go into these logs, and there's thousands of logs that are generated for users within your tenant. So it makes it just not very time effective to really be able to search through these logs. But when we think about a sign-in in general, there's just so many factors that we get into when we talk about all the attributes that make up a sign-in, much like the user attributes here. So we have considerations for, was conditional access applied? Was the sign-in success or failure? What location was the user signing in from? Maybe that's the IP address, maybe that's the actual geographic location that we have to take in mind. What was the device that the user was signing in from? What was the application that the user was signing into? Were there tokens in use? And we'll see that here in just a few minutes within the portal. But we have concepts of primary refresh tokens that allow us to use a prior MFA grant to actually sign in, which can cause some inaccuracies in our reporting that you'll see here in a couple of minutes. You have considerations for, what was the user signing in with? or who was the user that was signing in here. And then you also get reporting on was single-factor authentication used or was multi-factor authentication used. And this kind of list kind of goes on and on. If you look in the portal, which you'll see here in a second, you can see a ton of these filters for these sign-in logs, and sometimes they contradict with each other, which makes it really hard to report on. So let's actually dive in there now and see more of that reporting so you can understand what's going on within the actual activity that we see between the entre logs for coverage, for conditional access, and then the individual sign-ins. So from a logging perspective here under conditional access, we have this coverage button, which is interesting because it can show us where we have sign-ins in the sign-in log where conditional access is not being applied, and we have percentage of users covered against certain applications here. So there may be an application like Microsoft Office where I want to say, okay, what user is having conditional access not being applied to them, and this is within this 7-day period. This is where I have some problems though with reporting, where it can create a lot of noise when we talk about the sign-in logs. If we take a look at one of these records, you'll notice here that the requirement was multi-factor authentication. It was successful, but then in the additional details that shows MFA requirement satisfied by claiming the token, because we're using a primary refresh token here, which is keeping our session going as far as our application, and we're not having any conditional access being applied in that particular use case. So it's a little bit of false positive reporting that we get here. And if you think about that across all of the tenants that you manage, there's quite a lot of noise. I've altered the filters here for another view or lens that you could look at where the sign-in status, like they successfully got in, the authentication requirement is only single factor, user type is a member, not a guest here. For what we're looking at, we can actually see 2 records here. So I can see in this case, single factor authentication, it was successful. In conditional access though, it's interesting because we had these policies here. We have one policy where the user is being excluded from or it wasn't applied. If we look at this here and we say the application's matched, and then we have the direct exclusion for the user within this policy. But the interesting thing here is if you were to add the filter here for conditional access, you do have, if you say that conditional access was successful, you do have those sign-ins show up, but we say it was not applied or if there was a failure. In this particular case, we have no sign-ins found. So it's an interesting kind of dynamic that you're working with here with these sign-in logs, not only just due to the unique constraint of all these filters that could be being applied, but also just due to the verboseness of how many logs there are. It's really not scalable for you to look at doing this investigation across all of your tenants for all users just to look for MFA gaps and things like that. You're better off looking at the MFA exclusions on those MFA enforced policies within the conditional access section. So with that, let's take a look at some helpful tools. In particular, one that I've been working on here called Cloud Capsule could actually help you identify this activity across your customers. So the tool here is called Cloud Capsule. This is an expansion of the work that I've done with enablement around policy configuration, and I'm getting into some drift detection here. You can actually go to cloudcapsule.io and run a free assessment to see what this looks like. But you can sign in with your Microsoft credentials here and enter a tenant to run an assessment on. And effectively here, it's doing an assessment to look for things like MFA exclusions. And if I actually go to a different tenant here, we'll be able to see we have one user with MFA, and we have some deep reporting here as well. So if I click on this, I'll be brought down into that section. And really what I'm doing here is a lot of that filtering that I showed you before, where we want to look for licensed users who are enabled, who have a mailbox, who are not shared, they have actual membership, they're not a guest within the account. We certainly have other lenses that we want to look at, but this is kind of our primary lens that you'd like to see. And it's also taking into consideration, are they factored in with conditional access? Are they factored in with security defaults? What exactly are we looking at here? And then you could also see things like where you have weak MFA applied to users, as well as their holistic user authentication methods. So what methods do they have registered within the tenant? Are they more phishing resistant? Are they weaker, like phone or email? Or is it more of a FIDO2 Windows Hello considerations or Microsoft Authenticator? If we get into the policies as well, we can also see users being excluded either through direct exclusion or through group membership with our MFA enforced conditional access policies. So we can see here, this is where Oliver Queen, that user that doesn't have MFA, is being actually excluded, and we can see directly within the policy what that looks like. If we look at another tenant here in the policy section, we can actually see some other examples here where we have some direct exclusion, and then we have some groups where these users are being excluded from as part of that group. So back to my earlier comment where you have natural deviations or drift, part of group membership, this gives you a lot more visibility into seeing those direct users that are being excluded from these MFA enforced policies that you can just quickly review within the customer tenant without having to kind of navigate across the various pages in the Entra portal to figure all of this out. So I really wanted to do this to avoid a lot of the scripts that I built in the past that you would have to figure out these policies or figure out this information. This also does include your authentication method policy, whether or not you have number matching involved as well too. So definitely check this out just to run an assessment and see where your tenants are sitting today, not only with these policies, it maps against the CIS framework as well. Okay guys, that's everything I have for you today. Definitely comment below with any questions you had about what we covered. Check out Cloud Capsule and sign up. You can run a free assessment with this tool here as well, just to see what the MFA reporting looks like. And as always, subscribe to the channel if you want to see more content around Microsoft and the MSP space. I'll see you guys next week.